Tawede, welcome back to part 2 of Krotoa and the slavery of indigenous children. My name is Atakwa and I was born extinct. While Jan van Riebeeck's son was the first free burger born in the Cape, Krotoa's second child is the first recorded child of mixed race born in the Cape. Abraham van Riebeeck went on to become the Governor General of Batavia. Krotoa is the first indigenous Khoi to appear in European written records. She was fast indoctrinated with the Christian religion and baptized by the Dutch Reform Minister. She only became a free burger at the age of 22. Krotoa was baptized and named after Eva, who, according to Christianity, first brought sin into the world. Krotoa was the child of the sister of Chief Ochumato, the leader of the Goringaikona. He was known by the Dutch invader as Harry or Harry die Strandloper. It's not clear what had happened to Krotoa's mother. She was born in 1642 and died in 1674 on Robben Island at the age of 31. Chief Ochumato and Krotoa were the first to mix High Dutch indigenous languages and the language of stolen and enslaved people into the patois, known today as Afrikaans. She was the first indigenous person to be taken into a European household. Krotoa was strategically important to the Dutch, yet despite her desperate situation, she stayed loyal to the Khoi strategy of keeping the Dutch trapped in the Cape without any option but to get back on their ships and return to their motherland. Krotoa's sister was the wife of the wealthy and powerful chief Odasau of the mighty Pochahontas nation. Her sister was responsible for her education at the time the invader arrived. She was preparing the 11-year-old for puberty rites. Krotoa's hand was promised to be married to the son of the chief of the Kochinoa. It's believed that Krotoa was taken to the barracks on the night of October 1652 during Van Riebeeck's first raid on the Khoi. Shortly after arrival in the army barracks, this child was expected by Jan van Riebeeck to spy on her people, assist with trade negotiations, and the conversion of the heathens into Christianity. The child Krotoa was now caught between two cultures. She was forced to adapt to the slave, interpreter, negotiation role, to the point that she knew to wear a sari when she was a slave, Dutch attire when expected to translate, and ethnic attire for visits to her people. Van Riebeeck also noted that the child did not abandon her traditions for European culture. His diary states that she often stripped off her Indian dress, sarong, and kaparangs for her hides for visits to her people. She was a child of 11 or 12 when she was renamed Ava, putting an end to her carefree days with her clan and Khoi women and children, putting her at the mercy of the sex-obsessed European men. Van Riebeeck's diary claims that she at first worked for his wife Maria de la Quellerie as a nanny, but then worked as Portuguese, French and Dutch translator, negotiating between the invader and Chief Odasau. In his journal entry in 1654, he mentioned Krotoa as the girl who's living with us in the service of my wife from the beginning. After that, he mentioned the child 200 times in 65 entries. Van Riebeeck's diary entries speak victoriously of the enslavement of indigenous people through the provision of alcohol and tobacco, which reduced the price of commodities bartered with the Khoi. These recordings suggest that brandy and tobacco and bread would be given when Krotoa was given permission to see her family. Krotoa may have been the first victim of the dop system, which has been ongoing for almost 400 years and is still visible on the winelands in the Cape. Krotoa was already in the army base when Van Riebeeck penned his first plan to rid the Cape of indigenous people. One of the biggest challenges for both Krotoa and other negotiators was explaining to the barbaric and savage European that the Khoi, cattle owning and land were holistically connected to spiritualism, and that the Khoi found the treatment of the cattle barbaric, honoring the sacredness of all living beings, bestows personal power, healing, and knowledge. This still escapes the colonizer to this very day. Krotoa escaped the army garrison with the help of her uncle Ochumato after 2 years, but had to return to what was now a huge army garrison, where she lived with old white roughneck soldiers and sailors. Belonging to the indigenous community and being enslaved by the Dutch was viewed with suspicion by her people, while Van Riebeeck felt that she was overly committed to her clan and her uncle Ochumato. These pedophiles fathered 3 children with her, and by the time she was 19, she was further stigmatized as an unmarried mother. In just a decade, Krotoa had her puberty rites, a Christian baptism in 1662, and a Christian marriage to the Danish Pieter van Mierhof. She was very loyal to her uncle Ochumato, especially as he became more and more unwelcome in the Cape by Van Riebeeck and his savages. In her preteen, she was obedient and compliant, trying to please both sides, but in her teens, her own thinking developed, and the child advocated, much to the horror of Van Riebeeck, for the Khoi way of life and an abandonment of the Dutch settlement. After a while, she was viewed as a traitor by both her people and Van Riebeeck. Somehow Krotoa managed to convince the invader that the original landowner's vision for their country was in line with theirs, to keep the peace. Although Van Riebeeck and his diarist kept meticulous records, there was no record whatsoever of Krotoa and her family and her people ever being paid for their service. After her 6th pregnancy, at the age of 18, a year after the birth of her son Jacobus in 1661, she was married to Pieter van Mierhof, who was 15 at the time. Mierhof, strangely enough, was a soldier, a surgeon, slave trader, medical doctor, and traveler who made 6 expeditions to the Cape from 1664 to 1668. Krotoa and Van Mierhof were the 2nd European and indigenous slave to wed in the Cape. The fathers of her other children are unknown, as it was custom not to acknowledge the children. To improve their condition, the church proclamation called for the baptism of all slave children, especially those of mixed race. Poor houses were established for children proven to have European blood. Removing mixed race children from their enslaved mothers became common. Danish Pieter van Mierhof arrived in the Cape as Pieter Hafgaard, but adopted a new name, as was Dutch custom in the colony at the time. Known as the Heeren 17 surgeon responsible for amputation, the marriage was another hardship, but ensured that the child was contained. Van Mierhof was abusive and planned to tame Krotoa. It was only when she was found unconscious on Robben Island after 3 days that a doctor was brought from the mainland. 2 of her earlier children, Antonij and Jeronimus, listed as illegitimate in the records, died in infancy. It is not clear if Krotoa was afforded any of the birthing rights practiced in the Khoi community. This would have included 2 birthing companions, a midwife. She would have been given to boil tobacco in the milk if the labor was difficult. In May 1665, to keep the undesirable marriage out of sight, Meerhof was promoted to superintendent of Robben Island. They were quickly dispatched to Robben Island, which cut Krotoa off from a community. Van Meerhof was appointed superintendent responsible for snakes, spiders, and other dangerous animals. Van Riebeeck was transferred to Batavia, Jakarta in 1662. Ochumota died shortly afterwards, leaving Krotoa vulnerable. Her mother died, and so did her sister, the wife of the powerful chief Odesua. On his departure from the Cape, Van Riebeeck's diary entry stated that Krotoa cannot be trusted, as she aided and abetted her people with strategic information and advice during the First Khoi-Dutch War of 1659 and 1660. In 1673, a Dutch visitor, Willem ten Tyn, after a visit to Robben Island, described Krotoa as a masterpiece of nature. She embraced Christianity, spoke fluent English, Dutch, and French and Portuguese, and was conversant in the Holy Scriptures. In short, she was most commendable, being trained in all womanly crafts and married to one of the best surgeons of the year in 17. During her 3 years on Robben Island, she came to the mainland only for baptism of her children and for medical attention. After she was widowed, she returned with a slave from Cape Verde. On 30 September 1668, Zachariah Wagenaar, the new governor of the Cape, recorded in his journal that on our boats returns from the island with Ava and her children and a quantity of scabs. She was marginalized, ridiculed, and ostracized by the settler community. She sank into depression. Wagenaar threatened to jail Krotoa on Robben Island for her revolutionary talk. She was outspoken against the invasion and the ever-expanding settlement and was thrown into the dungeon at the garrison before being banished to Robben Island. She was charged with immoral behavior. On 10 February 1669, she was taken into custody by the Dutch soldiers and thrown into a dungeon, brutally torturing and demonizing her. In 1669, banished to Robben Island, isolating her from her roots once again. She was one of 2 women on the island, with European convicts, stowaways, pirates, and criminals. The 3 children she had with Van Meerhof were removed from her by missionaries before she was banished. After 5 years on Robben Island, Krotoa died on 29 June 1674 and was buried at the army barracks. But even in death, she was not allowed to rest. Her remains were later removed and reburied at the Grote Kerk. The official diarist at the Cape recorded that, with dogs she returned to her own vomit, a clear illustration that nature, no matter how tightly muzzled by imprinted moral principles, reverts to its unborn qualities. Krotoa's youngest child, Petronella, and Salomon were taken to Mauritius. Petronella returned to the Cape in 1709. In 2014, descendants of Krotoa conducted a ceremony in the garrison, now named the Cape Castle or the Fort, calling for the return of the spirit of Krotoa. Much of Van Riebeeck's diary entries talk of Krotoa as a heroine in her duties as cultural ambassador, while the Wagenaar governor who had very little affection for the Khoi, painted a picture of her as a morally decadent wife and a mother of fallen children and a fallen Christian. The invader later depicted Krotoa as a person with loose morals, a drunkard and a prostitute. As late as 1883, her name, Ava, was still a warning against miscegenation. While the kidnapping of indigenous children had mostly ceased in the 20th century, the practice has continued in the USA, Mexico, and Canada with very little to no investigation by the law enforcement. Indigenous families in Australia, Canada, and America are starting a healing process while still searching through hidden archives of the dreaded residential schools where hundreds of thousands of children were taken to be civilized. Meanwhile, Belgium finally admitted and apologized for stealing over 20,000 children of mixed race between the 1860s for fostering by Catholic and other institutions in Belgium. Indigenous women only recently found their voices in calling out this promiscuous narrative and over and hypersexualization narrative propagated by the colonizer. Whether historians and popular media choose to portray these three girls as villains or heroines, these women did not have any power in their actions and their existence. They were slaves. Kaigagangs for your time, Cape of Good Hope, Cape of Storms, Table Bay, Falls Bay, Settler. It was not yours to take. My name is Atakwa, and I was born extinct.